our students, our faculty, our alumni, and our friends have joined us here this evening for the Henry M. Scharf Memorial Lecture on Current Affairs, featuring Liz Truss, 56th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and current Member of Parliament. Now, before I introduce Ms. Truss, I would like to take a brief moment to share with you why we're here tonight, to talk a moment about why the Institute hosts this annual event and what we're hoping that you will experience this evening. The Eisenhower Institute was founded more than 40 years ago by Susan Eisenhower, who joins us here this evening. Susan is a renowned expert on national security, energy security, strategic leadership. We are fortunate to continue to have her as our expert in residence at the Institute, working one-on-one with students in our premier seminar, Strategy and Leadership in Transformational Times. Think about it. No name could better describe the times that we are in right now. Susan is She is, of course, the granddaughter of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, for whom the Institute is named. Susan, thank you for laying the foundation for the work that we're doing here and the important work to continue. We appreciate it. We are also joined tonight here in Washington by more than 40 students and others from Gettysburg College, from our community in Pennsylvania. Their presence underscores the college's important commitment to expanding liberal arts education to the nation's capital. We are thrilled that you are all here. We're also joined by our online audience streaming this evening to our social media platforms, and I want to especially thank our staff and our student-led communication staff for making that happen. Our staff, especially in your tireless efforts, have made this evening, I'm going to declare it already, a success. Now, the mission of the Institute, as you will see in your program, is connecting young leaders with public policy experts and leaders and hands-on work to prepare you for a lifetime of public, private, and nonprofit service. We aim to create responsible global citizens who will inspire the world to meaningful action. We are nonpartisan, and we are dedicated to the values of democracy and fact-based inquiry. We do this providing forums like this to spark civil discourse on important issues. And let me say a word briefly about civil discourse. This is something that is very important to us as an institute and very important to me personally as well. EI and Gettysburg College are dedicated to sparking constructive conversations among people who think differently, among people who bring varying perspectives and points of view to the table. In the spirit of President Eisenhower and the spirit of his middle way approach, we hope to inspire you to reach across difference, to encourage you to embrace difference, and to challenge ourselves to welcome different perspectives along with our own. And so I look forward to launching that conversation tonight. A bit about the lecture. The Henry M. Scharf Memorial Lecture is one of 3 major speaking events hosted by the Institute. It was established more than 4 decades ago to honor a Gettysburg College graduate, like some of you in the audience, who contributed greatly to our community. Past lecturers have included politicians, journalists, those in academia, nonprofit leaders, and others whose voices add to our national and our international conversation. And so tonight, we welcome the Honorable Liz Truss into that conversation. Ms. Truss, as you know, served as the 56th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and leader of the Conservative Party. She is a long-standing advocate for limited government, low taxes, and free market policies. Now, during her term as the country's government leader, she pitched an economic plan, led the country in mourning the death of Queen Elizabeth, and stepped down after 49 days amid resistance and reaction to her plans for the country. She has written a book, and we're looking forward to hearing her thoughts about that. Previously, she served, and I think it's important to talk a little bit about her background prior to that role. She served as Secretary of State for International Trade and President of the Board of Trade following the Brexit vote in 2016. She established the UK's first independent tariff regime in more than 40 years as the country resumed its seat at the World Trade Organization. She signed trade deals with a number of countries and kicked off negotiations as well with the United States. Before that, Ms. Truss was appointed as the UK's Foreign Secretary She was the first woman to serve as Lord Chancellor. She has served in cabinet and high-level positions focused on justice, the Treasury, environment, women inequalities, childcare, and education. I'm just throwing it all out there. And I do this because I know our students, and they're going to have lots of very interesting questions. Speaking of that, tonight's remarks will be followed by an audience Q&A moderated by Steve Scully, Senior Vice President of Communications for the Bipartisan Policy Center, a fellow journalist, host of the briefing on SiriusXM, and has served as political editor, host, and senior executive producer at C-SPAN. That is more than enough for me at this time. Please join me in welcoming our Scharf Lecturer for the evening, Liz Truss.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with such a distinguished group and talking to the Eisenhower Institute. And the subtitle of my book in Britain is called The Only Conservative in the Room. It's called 10 Years to Save the West, The Only Conservative in the Room. And the reason that I put that subtitle in was that when I served as leader of the United Kingdom, when I served as Foreign Secretary, I was the only conservative in the room. In the United States, Joe Biden is in office. In Canada is Justin Trudeau. And in France is Emmanuel Macron. And we have Olaf Scholz in Germany. And I was asking myself the question, why is it that conservatives across the world seem to have lost the argument? You know, why is it that the policies I so fervently believe in, policies like small government, policies like low taxes and free markets, why have they become less fashionable, and why have we seen the left on the rise? And it really hasn't been a great time to be a small state conservative. If we look at where we were at the turn of the century, the US was spending roughly 27% of its GDP on the government, and the UK was spending 36%. The UK is now spending 45% of our GDP on the government, and the US is spending 36%. So you know where you're going to be in 25 years' time if things don't change. Because we are spending almost half of all the country's income on government services and on entitlements. And the question I ask myself is, how did we end up here? As somebody who believes in a dynamic economy and a small government, to be in a position of having your government spending 45% of GDP is quite extraordinary. Well, I think it started after the end of the Cold War. You know, we'd seen in the 1980s the US, the UK, Western Europe really have to step up to defeat the Soviet Union. We knew who the enemy was. We knew our economies had to be strong. We couldn't really carry the type of economy we had in the 1970s. There had to be bold reforms. And in the 70s, the United Kingdom was so broke that we had to go to the IMF for a bailout. That's how bad it got. But it was because things were bad and because there was a real threat that we faced that the West stood up. And that is where you saw Reaganomics, you saw in Britain the privatization program, and we saw much more dynamic economies being created. And I think what happened at the end of the Cold War, and I remember it when the Berlin Wall fell down and the sense of euphoria we all felt, I think we felt we'd won the argument. That the things we believed in, like supply side economics, sound monetary policy, control of government spending, we thought they were a given, and that everybody else had accepted them, and that countries like, you know, the newly independent Russia, China, had bought into those types of policies. And what did we do? Well, we made it easy for those countries we enabled China to join the World Trade Organization. Not on the same terms as countries like the United States, but on developing country terms, so they didn't have to fully disclose what was actually going on. We enabled President Putin There was one point at which he was a member of the G8, despite what was going on inside Russia. So the West turned a blind eye to what those regimes were doing, because we felt that if they had free market economics, if they had those opportunities, that freedom, things like freedom of speech and political freedom, would follow economic freedom. Now that has turned out to be a dramatically bad misjudgment, but that is the judgment that was made. And at the same time, I think we saw people on the right of politics, assuming the argument had been won, leaving politics altogether. And I meet a lot of brilliant supply-side economists who now work in the City of London, because they didn't feel that the battle needed to be won in academic institutions. They ceded that ground. So we have seen a growth in neo-Keynesianism, we've seen a growth in anti-capitalism, because those economists and people on the right thought the argument had been won. Now I went to the university, and this was make me sound very old to a lot of people in this audience, but I went to university in the 1990s, and I remember attending lectures about, I studied politics, philosophy and economics, and I attended lectures about people like Foucault, and I thought these ideas seem pretty crazy, this postmodernism, this deconstructionism, this idea that there's no such thing as objective truth. And I thought, I'm never going to hear about these things again. Surely this is just some French academic that isn't relevant anymore. And what amazed me, certainly from being in government in the last 14 years, is how those philosophies, which I thought of as niche, have become mainstream. Whether you call it neo-Marxism or postmodernism, the idea that the group is more important than the individual, the idea that power structures are what should be focused on rather than individual opportunity and liberty. Those ideas have now become very mainstream and have in fact become a major part of the political debate. And I think that crept up on the right. I think we were used to arguing with people who had socialist economic views, who believed in nationalisation, who believed in big government. I don't think we were used to arguing about identity politics. And I'd say the same about the environmental agenda. The environmental agenda, again, seemed like a minority sport. And my parents were of the left. In the 1980s, they were associated with the Ecology Party and the campaign for nuclear disarmament. So I saw a lot of those people, but they weren't the mainstream of politics. Whereas now we have politicians who are actively arguing for degrowth policies, which is again the opposite of what I think helps deliver a successful society and empowers people. So this new left has crept up on conservatives in politics. And what I think the left have also done is, rather than just having those arguments at the ballot box, they have sought to have the arguments by winning over institutions, whether those be universities, whether it's the corporate sector, whether it's the bureaucracy itself, in a way that simply wasn't the case in the past. And Britain has always had an impartial civil service since the 19th century. So the idea of having those philosophies embedded in the institutions is a relatively new one for Britain. But what I've noticed in my time in office of being a minister is that decisions that were previously left to democratically elected politicians are now taken by bodies that we call quangos. Now, I know you don't have the word in America, but the Environmental Protection Agency here is what we would call a quango in Britain. It's a quasi-government body. And the point is that those people are independently established in statute. So as an elected politician, it's quite difficult to affect what they do unless you're prepared to legislate to abolish them. And by the way, in Britain, if you do have a majority in the House of Commons, you can do that. You know, our constitution is more flexible. You are able to do that. And what we've also seen is the growth of international institutions as well that impose limits on what democratically elected governments are able to do. Now, a classic example for the UK was the EU. We've now left the EU, but we're still part of the European Convention of Human Rights, and we've just had a ruling last week that the European Court has imposed particular climate change policies on Switzerland. So what we're seeing is we're seeing international institutions that are more active and intervening in decisions that were previously political. Again, we also see that in the United Kingdom. One of the changes Tony Blair made was creating a Supreme Court, which we never had before in Britain, and creating a Judicial Appointments Commission for the appointment of judges, whereas previously it had been a member of the cabinet who'd appointed those senior judges, therefore being democratically accountable. So what I think we've seen over the past 25 years is a big shift. We've seen more power going to the hands of unelected officials and bureaucrats, and we've also seen the left of politics fighting different battles, fighting battles around identity politics, around net zero and climate change and the environment, and also around issues like human rights. And another major change the Blair government made was putting the ECHR essentially into UK law through the Human Rights Act. So we have a lot of legislation, legacy legislation, that now ties government ministers' hands. So this takes me to my time in office as Prime Minister. So I'd spent many years in government having various battles, whether it was the education establishment about trying to make the maths curriculum more rigorous, whether it was environmentalists trying to make our environmental policies pro-growth rather than stopping growth in the economy, or whether it was the judicial establishment trying to make our judicial system more accountable. But when I got to number 10, the main concern I had was about our economy, because the UK economy has not been growing at a significant rate, essentially for the last couple of decades. And whereas in the 1990s and 2000s, we almost caught up with the US in terms of GDP per capita, we're now about, the average household in Britain is now about $20,000 behind the average house in the US every year. So there is a significant difference between the levels of economic opportunity in Britain, and our levels of economic opportunity are actually relatively similar to our European counterparts, like the Germans and the French. The US has taken off and the gap has grown. So I know things seem difficult in the US economy, and I hear that a lot, but really you should look at what's happening in Europe and the UK, where there has been a level of economic stagnation. And my analysis of why that has been is that we've seen a massive growth in the size of government. We've seen a huge amount of growth in the level of regulation, particularly on things like energy. So in America, one of the reasons your economy has been so successful is that you've gone ahead with fracking, which has made the the US energy independent, has brought down energy bills. Our energy bills in the UK are twice the cost of energy bills in the United States. And that obviously has an impact on industry competitiveness, it has an impact on households, and that is a big problem. We voted to leave the European Union back in 2016, but we still have got most of the European Union laws on our statute books. For example, the Working Time Directive, which directs how many hours people are able to work per week. So we haven't taken the liberalisation opportunities of Brexit. We've allowed the government to get bigger, and we've also allowed taxes to get higher, and British taxes are now the highest they've been for 70 years. And I think the reason for this is this failure of Conservatives over a number of decades to make the argument for those Conservative economic policies. So what I sought to do back in the summer of 2022, when I put myself forward to be party leader, is I wanted to change that trajectory. Because I believe that elections are fundamentally about how people feel. Do I feel that my household income's going up? Can I pay my electricity bill? Do I feel that my children's school is getting better? In Britain, can I get a doctor's appointment? That's harder than it sounds in Britain. These are the things that affect people, and a lot of politics is conducted. We call it SW1. You call it Washington DC, but a lot of political discussions just involve people that are interested in politics. Most people don't pay much attention to politics. What they care about is what's going on in their life.